Thanks so much for coming. So, you mentioned being a belief scholar.
Hmm.
You had really two things that you were interested in, and I was really focusing on them. One is Slenderman, and the
Hmm.
other is sleep paralysis. So,
Yes.
I'm hoping that you could talk to us about that.
Absolutely. So, I'll start with Slenderman. I will fully admit it was my students that got me into Slenderman. I did not know anything about it until my students brought it up to me. And, and it was so interesting to me when I first started hearing about it, because I thought, oh, wow, it's so rare that we actually get to see something from beginning to, wherever it ends up in creation. So we know exactly what date Slenderman was first posted on the internet. We know the poster, we know all the information about Slenderman, and that it was created on this one forum. It was in response to a challenge. It was just something like someone said, hey, let's make something creepy, and someone came up with Slenderman.
Yeah, it was
And that's like,
creepypasta,
and
right?
yeah, creepypasta, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it was the Something Awful forum was the first place it was actually ever posted, by the username was Victor Surge, but his real name is Eric Knudsen. And he made these photoshopped images and he put it out there, and people just really responded to it in this
Hmm.
way that they haven't responded to a lot of other things, and it just really caught on. And there was just something about the image, the words, the combination that just spoke to people in this really sort of fundamental way, that to me was just really interesting, because like why that image, why that moment, and then to watch how it changed, and it adapted online. And that's one of the things folklorists love to look at, is how things change over time, right? What sticks, what goes away, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So we like to look at the networks that people create and how they find each other, but we're really interested too in things, how things change. So to watch how a lot of people call it the Slenderman mythos, how that kind of like that developed, how we decided who Slenderman was and what he did and how that changes. But also just to see, a lot of my students, as we're going through the years, they grew up with Slenderman. Like they were kids when Slenderman was first created in 2009. So they've like their whole lives, they've known about Slenderman. So he kind of, in that way, kind of becomes like a boogeyman type figure
Yeah.
for children.
Yeah.
So he's like something that kids just know about. They don't go to the internet to find him. They hear about him from other kids. So it was really fascinating to see this supernatural creature sort of like emerge. But then people having these discussions about it, and it went in all these really interesting different directions, from everything from, can we create something? Can we bring something into existence by acknowledging it, which has always been something about the supernatural that we've always talked about, that sort of, a lot of people have this sort of general belief of ignore it and it will go away,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is really interesting too, to kind of think about, and to process in a lot of different ways. But yeah, so it's really kind of interesting to see how some people were talking about how we created Slenderman in like an actual way, just by thinking him up. But then there's all these other sort of directions he went, where he becomes a sort of a tool that we can use to discuss other things. So to me, that's really fascinating, because like it all depends on who you are and how he kind of works for you. So for some people, Slenderman becomes the sort of nameless, faceless internet, or
Hmm.
or even something like surveillance on the internet. So he becomes the faceless guy in a suit that's always watching you. So he has that sort of representation. And then for children, he has this boogeyman representation. And then for other people, I found for some people who are especially writing fan fiction, he becomes this sort of fantasy about getting back at the people who have hurt them, in this way that is, not fully socially acceptable, but more socially acceptable than them, you know, kind of raging out against a bully or something like that. So it becomes a way to talk about bullying, even. So that everybody has this this very different experience with him. And then for some people, he's just a joke, like he's funny. There's all kinds of parodies of Slenderman. And so like all the different directions that he really went was just so interesting to kind of see how that changed over time. And is it in or is it out? It's so funny because I'll ask my students, I'm like, is Slenderman cool? And they're like, and half of them are like, no, and the other half of them are like, yes. And, so it's so funny to kind of just see how people still to this day react, and this is, years later now.
Yeah.
He's still kind of with us.
Yeah, it's like over 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of amazing to see that this image has kind of stuck with us for so long, and that we've been using it for so long. It's really fascinating. So yeah, so I enjoy that, and I also really enjoy talking about sleep paralysis because I also do a lot of research in medicine. I'm very interested in medicine, and also just sort of how people understand their illnesses and how they process illness, and why they choose to do the things they do when it comes to seeking treatment. So I've always been really interested both in Slenderman from that perspective, because there is something called slender sickness, but also sleep paralysis. So worldwide, we know that about 20 to 30% of people experience sleep paralysis. And we know that a lot of people have the sensation where they wake up in the middle of the night, they're unable to move, they're unable to call out, they're not able to do anything. And sometimes that is also accompanied by a pressure on the chest or feeling like they have trouble breathing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people see something, some people don't. Some people hear footsteps, some people have the perception that somebody is there, but they don't see anything. So there's kind of a couple different experiences that can happen there. And we know that this happens worldwide to 20 to 30% of people. Mm-hmm. And to me, the most interesting part of that is it happens whether or not you have a name for it. So even if you don't know, like haven't heard of something like the old hag or Mara, or any of these sort of like nightmare type entities, or the notion, some people tie it back to witches or demons, and so there's a lot of different supernatural explanations for this. Even if you don't have any of those stories, no idea why this thing is happening to you, it still happens, right? So it's just something that happens to people, and our interpretation of it can be very, very different depending on what tradition we grew up in, if we're allowed to talk about it or not. But for those people, like, to speak about, not being able to talk about the supernatural, there are people out there, and it happens every semester when I teach this in class. I'll describe the experience, and I'll say, okay, like, how many people have ever had this? And, the hands start to kind of creep up. And I say, okay, yeah, it's about 20 to 30% of the people in the class. Okay, cool. Like, how many of you didn't realize until this moment that other people had this? And there's always at least a couple of people, sometimes more than a couple of people, who are like, yeah, no, I didn't realize, like, I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I was going crazy. I thought there was, and they have this, there's like this anxiety that lifts from them when they're able to talk about this incredibly normal thing that happens across the world worldwide, mm-hmm. right? And they have this sort of moment with, like, oh my gosh, it's not just me. I'm okay. There's nothing wrong with me. And David Huffer, who did study this a lot, was kind of talked about how a lot of people, if they heard these symptoms, might diagnose it as schizophrenia, but it's not schizophrenia. It's a very common thing that happens. Essentially, I'm going to give you the very quick medical sort of description of it. It's much more complicated than this, but essentially what happens is your brain shuts down your body so that you don't act out your dreams. Mm-hmm. And your brain basically wakes up and your body just hasn't woken up yet. So that's essentially what is happening. But we don't know why people see very similar things. And it's sort of the same thing too when you hear about near-death experiences.
Yeah.
Why does everyone see the long tunnel with the light at the end of it? Like, why do? And there's no way for us to know that. There's theories out there that like, oh, that's what your brain would look like as it is dying, or there's sort of like this is what the neural connectors would look like as these things are happening. But there's no way for us to know, right? There's really no way. We can't hook up a TV to a dying brain and see what that person is seeing. And it's the same thing with like sleep paralysis. We don't know, like, why is everybody seeing something very similar? Is it something that is absolutely explained by science, or is it not something that's absolutely explained by science? And we don't know, because there's just simply no way to find that out. But it's interesting that very, very similar experiences. And people who have never heard these stories before report almost identical types of stories. And to me, that's really fascinating, because to me, that is something's happening there, right? Like, that's evidence, right?
Absolutely.
So there's something going on.
Yeah.
And I don't know what kind of evidence it is, but it's evidence, right?
I agree. And it would be so great if more people would study it, from a scientific perspective. There is a neurologist actually who's done a really fascinating study on mediums, or no, let me restate that, people who speak in tongues, and connects it to possibly spirits. At any rate, and he sort of hooks them up to, I guess, an EEG and other things, takes images of their brain, and his results are really interesting. Unfortunately, very few people are doing studies, and I think it would be a great area to study.
It is such and to me too, especially when you can combine folklore with these other areas, and bring them all together, I think you can really learn some really interesting things. And we've seen this a lot too with even looking at native populations who for generations have been telling the stories about where they're from and how they first arrived to North America, and then they go back and do the genetic evidence, and they're like, oh, hey, they were right. And of course they're like, yeah, of course we know, we've been passing on this story for generations, but now we have this sort of scientific evidence to also show this. But it is funny that we don't value though that level of knowledge all the time. We don't value that indigenous knowledge. We don't value other types of knowledge that people have until we've proven it with science. And I think it's cool to bring those things together. But then at the same time, we also have to value that as evidence, right? We have to value that stuff and think about it. Where I went to, the university I went to in Newfoundland, there's this really famous story about this guy, Aldrich, who was the first person to really find a giant squid. And what he had done was just brilliant. He had taken all of the old captain's logs from all of these old ships, and he went through them, and he sat down, and he was a biologist, and he sat down and he went through and started looking at weather conditions. He had started looking at patterns, like times of year, where the ships were located when they saw them. And he saw a pattern. Like, he started to see, like, hey, these people are all having these giant squid sightings in these certain places. So he actually, it's a great story. He put out an advertisement. He figured where a next one should be. He put out an advertisement in the newspaper and was like, wanted one giant squid, which was like the equivalency essentially of saying, like, wanted one unicorn, right? Because people just didn't believe they existed. And I think it was like 2 or 3 days later, he had his giant squid. Because he had figured out that, like, no, this is a thing. Like, these are real creatures. They don't come to the surface very often because, of course, they're deep water creatures. They fall apart when they come up to the surface because they're used to having so much pressure. But he knew that there was something there. And, like, to me, when you can do that kind of research where you take those different forms of knowledge and bring them in instead of just dismissing them or ignoring them, that can really help you find some really fascinating things. And I think there's a lot more that we can do with that, where we can sit down and say, like, okay, we're having this thing where all of these kids who are being bullied are talking about Slenderman. Why are they talking about Slenderman? Like, what's the connection here? And it is that, maybe it's a way for them to talk about something that they're so stigmatized against talking about, or they feel that they're so powerless in talking about. It gives them a different way to talk about it, right? Because we're honestly, we're not very good at talking about bullying, especially cyberbullying. And a lot of times there's no sort of solution to that. But these kids can talk about Slenderman having this experience, and it gives them an outlet and a way to talk about it without alerting, grown-ups that they're, talking about these things, or having the wrong sort of reaction to what they are experiencing. But they're like, it gives them a voice, and a lot of times that's all people need is a voice.
Oh, absolutely.